Tonight, truth in politics. Former US President Joe Biden has been diagnosed with cancer, but it now seems he and White House staff deceived the public on the state of his cognitive health. In Australia, the Liberals elected a female leader, but is the party really behind her? And what was the strategy behind Labor's devastating advertising campaign against the coalition? On our panel tonight, Tim Ayres is Labor's new Industry, Innovation and Science Minister. Liberal Senator Dave Sharma has been a diplomat advising the government on foreign countries, their truth and lies. Dee Madigan is a key creative director and strategist who is behind the Labor Party's messaging. Former Victorian Liberal leader John Pesutto, who could be bankrupted after losing his defamation battle with fellow Liberal MP Moira Deeming. And Emma Shortis is a scholar in American politics, where the language of fake news is now part of the game. Welcome to Q&A. Carvelis, I want to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation on whose land we're broadcasting from tonight here in Melbourne. Remember, you can live stream us around the country on iView, all the socials. Quandra is the hashtag. We'd love you to get involved. But to get us started tonight, a kind of quick fire, super quick question for me. The Reserve Bank of Australia meets tomorrow, starting with you, Emma. Should they cut interest rates and by how much?
Sure, they should. I think the consensus is that they should, and probably by 0.25%, so get on with it.
All right, let's go to our first question tonight. And our first question comes from Adrienne Bennett. Hi, Adrienne.
Hi. My question to the panel is, given the news of Joe Biden's declining health and efforts by his staff to cover it up, I'd like to know if Joe Biden had stepped down a year earlier, would have it made a difference to the outcome of the presidential election result?
I think it's really remarkable, PK, that we're even talking about this, you know, that the Democrats are still litigating this. They're still fighting over Joe Biden. You know, CNN is so consumed by this issue and are talking really to each other. You know, this is the media and senior Democrats talking to each other about Joe Biden and not talking about the current president or the problems that
they're constantly talking about the current president, to be fair.
Well, I think at the moment they're consumed by Biden, you know, to the point where they're suggesting that this might have an impact on the 2028 Democratic primaries, which is insane. You know, I think this is really reflective of the Democrats' inability to reckon with Trump and their own failures in the campaign and what they should be doing going forward, which I think is probably talking a little bit more about the current president and his attacks on American democracy.
Sure. We've got a question now from Cameron Wood.
In the aftermath of the most recent election, there have been Conservative commentators claiming that the Liberal Party needs to move further to the right of politics. However, given the result in Bradfield and other electorates that the Liberal Party has lost to moderate independents, is this a responsible solution for a party that seeks government?
Now, there's been a lot of talk about the glass, well, there's the glass ceiling and then like its cousin, the glass cliff. Yep. And that's the language that's being used about what's happened to Susan Lee, you know. But is that fair? Do you think that's a fair assessment?
That she's on a glass cliff?
Yeah.
I think absolutely, and I think it says a lot about the state of the Liberal Party that it takes them getting to this point to elect or to appoint a woman leader. And I think that's part of the reason that we've seen this election result, is that women in particular saw, you know, Peter Dutton attempting to import a kind of Trumpian politics that spoke to men. You know, he was going on manosphere podcasts and speaking to men, and I think the result shows really clearly what women in particular think about that there just isn't this appetite for Trumpian politics in the Australian electorate more broadly. And I think, you know, that you're right, the Liberal Party has a lot of work to do, not just in representation, of course, but in actually speaking to women and the issues that they care about and addressing them substantively. And they've been punished for not doing that.
This question comes from Ian Wood.
Hi, PK. Straight after the 2022 election and now straight after the 2025 election, Anthony Albanese jets off overseas. I think he might go down as the most widely travelled PM in history. My question for the panel is, bearing in mind the turmoil in the world at the moment, especially with regard to trade, what good has all these overseas visits done for Australia?
Emma, this concern, though, that, people, just like our questioners, see the Prime Minister travelling around and sometimes there's a disconnect. How do you balance that?
Look, I think what the Trump administration is showing us is that you can't really draw lines between what happens domestically and what happens in the rest of the world. What happens in the world really matters to Australia, and it's really important for us to be there. I think intuitively we can all feel that this is a world historic moment. Donald Trump is busy dismantling the international rules-based order as we know it, and what Australia does in response to that really matters. And I think we often underestimate our own power and our own agency in that. Depending on the exchange rate of the day, Australia is the 12th or 13th biggest economy in the world, sometimes bigger than Russia. And so we can have a really big influence on rebuilding or building the institutions of international law after Donald Trump has dismantled them. And I think the election result shows that Australians care about that. They care about what happens in the world, and it's really important, I think, for Australia to be there and show our commitment to the international rule of law.
That's interesting.
Can I just add, PK, as well? I think it's really important to not draw lines necessarily between trade and the economy and security. Economic security is really important to Australians, and the Trump administration undermining economic security has a huge influence on us. The Trump administration potentially coming after the pharmaceutical benefit scheme in Australia has implications for Australian health security. And so I think it's really important that we don't try and draw those arbitrary lines and think about security more broadly and really have a think about what actually makes us safer.
Next, we're going to hear a question from Andy Hines. Hi, Andy.
Hi. My question is for the entire panel. Over the weekend, Melbourne teacher Oscar Jenkins was sentenced to 13 years in a Russian penal colony for fighting for Ukraine. Does Australia possess the power to negotiate for his release?
Emma.
It's such a good question and such a tricky one. I think, I was saying earlier that Australia has considerable diplomatic skill that we often underestimate. But diplomatically, this is a really tricky one. Australia has a good history, I think, of advocating for prisoners overseas, but this is going to be one that takes quiet diplomacy. I think, we need to be careful about falling into Putin's trap. He wants fodder for propaganda. He wants lots of attention on this case. And so as the Australian government is going to have to tread really carefully, and I think unusually in this case, tread really carefully around the United States as well. In I guess, normal times, we could expect support from the United States in these negotiations with Russia, but we can't underestimate how close ideologically Trump and the Trump administration are with Putin's Russia. And navigating that is going to be incredibly difficult and may unfortunately take quite a long time, but it's certainly possible.
That's an interesting point, though, you make. Our next question comes from Andy Lloyd.
I have no problem making the wealthy pay more tax, especially within the superannuation system, where tax breaks should be limited. But this proposed tax is unfair. We need investors to take risks. It's a fundamental principle of taxation that taxes should only be raised once the gains have been realised. So my question to the panel is, what are you doing to stop this tax and how can we help?
No. Well, Emma, I know you've got views. Do you want to say something?
I think it would be pretty nice to have over $3 million in super.
Sure,
What's that like?
But the principle, right, that more and more people over time, because it's not indexed, will enter that realm, that's a fact, right?
Well, look, I'm not an expert in superannuation, but I think, more broadly, I think we're in danger of falling into this trap that sometimes the Labor Party falls into and the Democrats have fallen into in the United States of tinkering around the edges and failing to be brave about the things that really do matter to Australians. And I think if we're going to be talking about things that are happening 30 years in the future, then we can be talking about some pretty brave, big things like, I don't know, acting on climate and the stuff that's really going to affect young Australians in particular, rather than, getting worried about super balances that are already over $3 million.
I'll put this to you, Dave Sharma. A quick question from Emily Lorenzen. Hi, Emily.
Hi, PK. My question for the panel is, how will Australia mitigate the impact on our research and innovation sector in the face of the funding withdrawals under the Trump administration?
Emma, quick word from you.
Sure, I think we can see this this is a huge opportunity. Australian universities are respected the world over, despite the hollowing out that they've experienced. And, you know, we can be encouraging those American researchers to come here, and we can be supporting Australian universities to build networks and to support their networks with American universities to withstand the attacks that they are experiencing. So I think this is a huge opportunity for Australia to invest in that sector and in innovation, and to broaden our relationship with the United States and mitigate against the worst instincts of Donald Trump at the same time.
Now, before we finish the show tonight, we've been making a bit of a feature at the end of Q&A when it gets all dark and serious, a bit of a light end to the show, something positive you're all reflecting on, and it doesn't have to be in the world of politics, but if it is, that's okay.
Look, I think with all the turmoil and uncertainty in the world, there is an opportunity for Australia to do more to stand on its own 2 feet. I mean, I think in many respects we've failed to grow up as a nation, or failed to properly define ourselves as a nation because we've allowed others to look after our security and our trade and the global order and whatnot. This is an opportunity, as Emma touched on before, for us to play a more influential role in helping create a positive world around us.
That's a good point. Emma?
I didn't think I'd be agreeing with Dave tonight.
Well, Q&A, ending in positives,
with each person.
bringing people on all sides of politics together.
Look, I think we're in a really scary moment, PK, and, you know, Donald Trump is dismantling the world order, but that offers us an opportunity. What Australia does in this moment matters, and the comprehensive re-election of the Labor government has given us space to do that and to play that role and to embrace what the Prime Minister has called progressive patriotism and really build a world that is better and more secure than the one we had before.
Thanks, Emma. Well, that's all we have time for. Thanks to our panel, Emma Shortis, Dave Sharma, Tim Ayres, Dee Madigan and John Pizzuto.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to keep up to date with all our latest research and work, sign up to our newsletter. Delivered every fortnight, it includes behind-the-scenes updates from Richard Dennis, an exclusive cartoon from Judy Horacek, details for our upcoming events and webinars, as well as explainers, graphs, and not to mention the latest cutting-edge research and analysis from the team here on the key issues that are facing Australia. Click the button on your screen to check it out.